Welcome to the Organizational Transformation Kung Fu Podcast with your hosts, Sandy Verrecchia and Jennifer Long.
Welcome to another episode of Organizational Transformation Kung Fu, the podcast that focuses on leadership development and leadership issues that organizations and people encounter and struggle with on the daily. If you're a first-time listener, you're probably wondering why we named our podcast Organizational Transformation Kung Fu. So Kung Fu means energy and time, and we believe that much like the art of Kung Fu, leadership is a practice that takes energy, time, patience, and a learner attitude. I'm here today with my good friend and podcast co-host, Jen T. Long, author and master coach from Own Up in Denver, Colorado. Good afternoon, Jen.
Good afternoon, Sandy Verrecchia, owner, master coach, Satori Consulting in Toronto, Canada.
Yay! Beautiful day here. What's it like in Denver?
It got beautiful. We started with a low of 32 today. So, it was a little cool, but we're working our way up to a balmy 72. Very happy about that.
Lovely. I think we have you beat by about 20 degrees.
Sweet.
Yeah. Awesome. So today in our podcast, we're going to explore the topic of influence. I recently asked a group of future leaders to share with us some of the aspects of being a leader that they wanted to learn more about and be more skilled in. And influencing up was a very popular theme. So today we're going to take a 360 view of influencing, starting with influencing down, then laterally and with peers, and finally influencing up. So let's start with a definition of influence. So over to you, Jen.
Let's talk about influence, because I think it's a little more complex than sometimes people think. And sometimes they get it confused with persuasion and other things. And we'll talk about that in a second. So let's lay down how we're defining it. And so I'm going to give you a pretty copious definition. Influence can be defined as the ability to affect, shape, or change the behaviors, attitudes, opinions, or decisions of others through various means without using force or direct command. This involves leveraging interpersonal skills, communication strategies, and personal or positional power to guide or inspire others toward that desired outcome. And that's kind of the big end. The so what is you're trying to get a better outcome. And that's why you're doing it.
Yes, and you're not doing it in a way that is mean-spirited or anything. It's really just this, full of integrity, full of trust, making sure that you're providing some value back so that somebody's behavior or mindset might shift.
Right? It's getting really good at understanding the nuance of the power dynamics and how it really kind of plays. Because a lot of times when we talk about influence, we talk about power and influence. And I found it interesting. I mean, power itself is more about positional power, right? So when you talk about influencing up, that's kind of the perception of the barrier is I've got to speak to power. And the interesting thing is influence itself is also power, but it's more about your level of expertise, right? That kind of power, your, what is it called? Referential power, which is that whole, who are you? What is your charisma? What is your sense of self? What is your, who are you in the mix of the project, the goal, the whatever that might be? How are you showing up there? And, relational power. Do you know this person? Do you not know this person? How relative are you to the situation? And so those are all parts of influence as power.
Yeah. And when we start talking about influencing down, so influencing your subordinates to do something that you need them to do without sort of the big stick and just sort of telling them to do it, there's some other power bases that sort of come into play, right? There's the ones about do they see you as a person who has legitimacy and like power legitimacy? Do they see you as somebody who has the reward power? If they do something that you want them to do, will you reward them for doing it? Do they see you as an expert? Do they see you as somebody who has connections that might help them in another way? But what's most important in all of those is not to lose sight of those, but is that, are you someone who can influence somebody to go the extra mile? Do they have the trust in you that you're doing what you're doing for the greater good, and that you can shift how they're doing things as, in a way that they feel included, in a way that they feel that they're not being told, and that that's a collaborative process in order to get there.
Right. It's an interesting nuance, and there's a level of reciprocity
Mhm.
that is involved in this. It's and it's not about give and take. Reciprocity feels a little bit different in terms of what do they get, what do what are you doing in as a result of the outcome that you're looking for, right? That kind of
Yeah, that the whole notion of if you do something for one person, that they all feel obligated to do it for you. So that whole law of reciprocity, it really comes through when you're thinking about influence, because you're not in a vacuum, right? You're not doing
Mhm.
something on your own. You're doing something that involves others, and sometimes with that comes this influence to create a need for somebody to do something for you as well. So it's sort
Right.
of back and forth.
It's that, that weird chip trading of I'm going to do this for you and then I'm going to hold this chip until a point where I need it and then I can use that to influence you at some later point. And that's just kind of how we get it done.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But I think it's important to think about because when I talk to this group of future leaders, when I talk about influence in general, people are always like, "How do I influence up? How do I get my boss to see me? How do I make my boss, see what I
Mm,
have to say adds value?" But I think it's important to remember that there is an element of influence when you're dealing with your teams as well, and so starting there, I think, is an important level setting because how you show up as a leader in regard to your team is
right.
as important as how you show up in a leader to your peer group and to your bosses above.
100%. 100%. Interesting. So what do we see as like effective ways? What are the skill sets? What are the things that we need to employ to be impacting as an
Yeah.
influencer? Right?
You
And I
know,
love the word influencer is so polluted by social media right now.
I know, right? So if I'm going to be on TikTok, no. Yeah, well, you're an influencer on LinkedIn.
Oh, am
Woohoo.
I?
Yep, you
Sweet.
are.
Yeah.
Um, I think the first and one of the most important things is having high emotional intelligence so that you understand who you are, how you show up, your work style, your y- things that you have to lean into that are more difficult for you. Because if you know yourself, you have a much better understanding, maybe a better chance to sit back and understand the people that you're dealing with. What do they need? Who are they? What's their work style? And so when you're thinking about how do I influence them, meeting them where they are is probably step number one.
Right, right. So if you know who you are, how much more, what kind of versatility do you need to show up in the moment to be effective with them? To meet somebody where they are, you've got to be smart enough to know you and smart enough to read them so you understand what your versatility is going to require.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the tools that you and I both love is DISC for that. It shows you your work style, your where your stresses are, where your motivators are, and can really help you understand how you work with somebody, or if it's a difficult person, how to work better with somebody. And if
Right.
you're trying to influence a decision or influence somebody to do something different, the best place to start is to really know who you're dealing with and what makes them tick.
Right. And there's a million kinds of discs out there. So let's be clear. We use Everything Disc, which is a Wiley product. It's the original science from the guy who invented it, Dr. Marsden. The way you find a Wiley disc is you look on the internet, and if it's got a small eye in the disc,
Yep.
chances are you're there. And the reason I say this is because it's a circular model, and around the circle, it gives you a bunch of words relative to each disc style, which are called priorities. And if you're going to be good at influencing, you want to understand somebody's priorities, how they see things, right? Where they see priority and how they prioritize things, because that's going to be critical in terms of understanding a strategy about how you would approach someone.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
So high emotional intelligence is really critically important in influencing for sure. I think the next, if I may, is trust. Having a trusting relationship. People need to trust you, that in you, that you are, going to do what you say you're going to do, that you're doing it for the right reasons, that
Yeah,
your outcome is their outcome.
right? We call that high reliability. Are you
Mhm.
somebody who shows up with high reliability? You're consistent in your behavior. You consistently do what you say you're going to do, that kind of thing. That's going to matter because we think about people based on how we feel about who they are. And so part of that influence is understanding, are you, so when we talk about EQ, it's, do you know how you impact? And you would know based on that information if you've got high reliability or not, let alone and expertise, right? So whatever you're talking about, whatever you're trying to influence on, how much do you know? How
Mhm.
deep is your knowledge set relative to what you're trying to get influence on? So that when you talk about trying to influence up and getting your boss to see you relative to what, right? Because just being seen is one thing, but being seen as what?
Mhm.
Being seen as an expert, being seen as interested in becoming an expert at something. I mean, you got to parse that down.
Yeah, yeah. The holder of information, whatever it might be.
Yeah, exactly. Um, we talked about understanding motivations, which I would say lines up to um, priorities. What are people motivated by? That motivation's not just personally, but also think politically.
Mhm.
What are the politics of what you're trying to do? What are you trying to bridge a gap that's a little too far for where you are in your career if you're trying to influence up? Are you doing it in the right time in the right place, right? Under the right circumstances, depending on what you're trying to influence on? All of those things are going to play into effective strategy.
Yeah, and I think sitting back and reflecting on what your political motivation might be as well, right?
Hmm.
What is it that is really pushing you in this direction to really want to influence a decision or an outcome? And is it politically motivated or personally motivated versus
Hmm.
the greater good of the organization? And we have to really think about that because alignment is critical. And when you're thinking about trying to shift somebody's perspective or shift somebody's ideas or shift somebody's values towards something, that you need to understand what the strategy is overall. Where does it align to the priorities of the organization? Where does it fall into the strategy? Where does it, so that when you're putting your pitch together, I guess if you put your pitch together, how are we tying it to something that is more important than just getting the outcome?
Right, right. And as we're talking about this, I'm flashing in my brain too. There's millions of instances of influence conversations in the movies, right? Where the guy shows up and he puts his foot up on the desk, and we're like, "Can we just have a heart to heart? We get a bottle of scotch and put it on the desk." I mean, there's always sort of these moments, or we're elbow to elbow at a bar, and we're at an offsite, and we're having this, you know, and they're sort of always pictured in these spur of the moment things. But I really feel like if you're good at influencing, you've really thought through how this conversation is going to go, and when your opportunity shows up, you're going to recognize the opportunity. It's not just I happen to all the time. Sometimes it is, but I would say if you're really good at influence, you're thinking about it. You're thinking about how to do it.
Yeah, I think there's different levels of it, Jen. I think there's the um, if you're good at influencing, it's probably just an innate skill that you do on the fly all the time, right? It's just who you are.
Hmm.
But when the stakes are higher, then you really need to give the thought, the mental fortitude toward it. I guess it's just so that because it's more important. So I
Hmm.
think there are people that innately are good at influencing. I think we see
Hmm.
those leaders that are just sort of high charisma and they seem to float in and float out and they just get what they want all the time.
Yeah.
Whether it's a learned skill, it's a skill that sort of just comes across as effortless.
Well, right. And so I would say because I'm on the disc as an I, D, which I is influence. And so part of that is the natural tendency of eyes to be relationship based, right? And when you're naturally relationship based, that whole understanding of the nuance of how relationships work and what the reciprocity is, and all those things. Those are going to be part of your innate skill set. So knowing that's why, I mean, knowing that you already have that as an innate sense, you can leverage off that. And then you're really paying attention more to the strategy, opportunity, and impact of what you're trying to influence as opposed to worrying about how to do it. But if you are not driven by relationship and you're driven by, I think C's are a whole different can of worms, and C's are going to have a tougher time of influence because they're going to tend to want to rationalize and provide logic and walk you through thinking, which isn't always necessary the best. I mean, it's part of influence, but I think one of the key skills is understanding the emotional drive.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think, yeah, absolutely. I had another thought on that one, but it just completely went out of my head. So onward we go.
Onward we go. Yeah. So another part, I think, so we've talked about communication, we've talked about trust, we've talked about relationship focus, we've talked about motivation. And influence also is an interesting kind of negotiation adjacent skill.
Absolutely. And it's, yeah, yeah. When I taught negotiations at college, it was all about influencing the decision. So that getting to that win-win-win through, through influencing the conversation. So they are absolutely combined.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we kind of forget that there is a little bit of a negotiation when you're looking for a shift. How much of a shift, right? What are you
Yeah.
okay with, and where's the line, right? Of
Yeah,
this isn't
exactly.
working or it is. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And what about persuasion then? Where does that fall in, do you think?
Well, what is the difference, do you think, between persuasion and influence?
I think persuasion is more about convincing someone to change their behavior versus influence. It's more around shifting somebody's attitude or behaviors or beliefs.
Persuasion feels to me like a C strategy, like the analysis, the logic, the
Mhm.
rationalization, right? Whereas influence to me feels like, because it's power based, it has a lot more to do with the weightiness of you as a person and what the
Mhm.
interpersonal aspects are there of the trust and the expertise and all the stuff we've talked about. Whereas
Yeah.
persuasion seems like it's the around the thing as opposed to, it doesn't include you as a person per se.
Mm. And
That's just
persuasion,
a
I think, is a harder skill, versus a soft skill. I think it's much more about making that shift happen versus organically making it happen. So sort of
right.
forcing it, if you will.
More
So I think,
directive, more
yeah,
directive.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to come
and
with
we
a
have to be
slide deck and a
careful.
PowerPoint and a pitch. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but you have to be careful, right? I think there are times when people think they're in influence mode, but they're in persuasion mode, and how do they show up in that at that time, right?
Right. And it's a slippery slope
Mhm.
from influence to persuasion to manipulation.
Yes, yes, and we never want to be in manipulation, and we've all been there, not being the manipulator, but working for people that perhaps have been, seen as that. And you're right; it's a very fine line between the two, and how people are seeing you. Part of it is a trust factor, without a doubt, right? If there's low trust, they may see somebody as more of a manipulator versus an influencer. Could be style.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's
It's
different
a,
things that sort of crop up.
yeah, I was interested to get a little understanding of when we cross into manipulation, what's happening, what goes on for us. Um, and the information I got on this was interesting to me, because I was like, how do we tend to cross the line in relationships, intentionally or not intentionally? Like, what is that where do we start to blur it? And misrepresentation of information was one of the things that came up, right? Where you're spinning how you see something, right? And you're spinning it to such a degree that you're no longer really representing what the information is. You're just leveraging it to your own end. So you're either distorting the facts or you're withholding, which is an
Yeah.
interesting, um, or you're exploiting power dynamics.
It's a power play.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a power play when you withhold information,
yeah,
right?
right. Your
So
your children,
again, high EQ, high
high
EQ. So
EQ.
you know that you're not sort of playing in that zone because it can be detrimental.
Right? And there's a different nuance between asking somebody a tough question that has them question something about what they're doing or how they're seeing something versus putting somebody on a guilt trip. I was fascinated by what showed up as information about what when you cross the line into manipulation, what is that? What happens in those moments? And the first thing on the list was the misrepresentation of information, where you either skew information, right,
Mhm.
in your direction in a way, take it too far, distort the facts in some way, or withhold information, right? Those
Yeah.
are both ways that if you're not being full up with, it can be interpreted this way, or it can be interpreted this way, or however you're talking to it, right? Because that's also going to be a demonstration of your level of knowledge and expertise and all that, um, etc. So that I thought was one of the interesting things. And sometimes I don't think we realize we're working so hard, we want it so bad that giving people all the information and letting them talk through, right? Because
Yeah.
then you can only influence how they see it anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Withholding information is a big one, and I think it's probably one of the biggest ways to manipulate something is not giving out somebody all the facts in order to really rationalize the decision that needs to be made or whatever the outcome might be. Yeah, I see that as a big one, and I think we've all worked for people that have we've seen it happen in the past. I certainly have. I've seen it sort of in action, and you don't I don't know if you call it in the moment, you probably don't call it manipulation. You would, but their integrity just gets chipped away out. And so when you're talking about influencing and the trust that comes with being an influencer, your integrity is paramount to that. So the minute you sort of slide down that slope outside of persuasion and into something a little bit more harsh, I think your integrity takes certainly a slap
A
every time
huge
you do
hit,
it.
right? This
Yeah.
is this is the basis of when we get angry at fake news, right? Because
Yeah.
it's become manipulation
Yeah.
because they are distorting the facts and everyone wants to dispute the facts, right? And journalism is based on a balanced reporting of all the facts. And that's what makes it reliable and trustworthy. And it's no different in relationship. And
Yeah.
so that's an easy and sad example for everyone to
Yes.
understand. Um, the other one was right abuse of authority, right, exploiting a power dynamic, using
Yeah.
power position, using whatever it is to get to influence, to get access, to do whatever that is. Um, and emotional manipulation,
Mm.
right? And that's when I was kind of talking about when it's one thing to ask challenging questions, right? To get people to rethink how they see something or to question why they hold a belief that may not be true, right? What are they
Mhm.
holding on to, and how do you engage in a meaningful understanding around something versus guilt tripping?
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the skills that people need to have is leading into the skill of curiosity. Right. So
Mm,
if you're not going to be in manipulation mode and you're in influence mode and you're curious about the other person's perspective on things, it can go a long way to understand that perspective and to meet somewhere where it actually makes sense for both. But I think when in doubt, lean into curiosity because that just enables a conversation to happen. And you can't be curious, I don't think, in manipulation mode because it's all about you.
right. And that goes to the communication strategy around influence isn't about narrowing the focus. Influence is really about creating space
Mhm.
and creating space for understanding and mutuality and perspective, because that leans into the reciprocity. It's all sort of, I think it's counterintuitive. I think when we want to influence, we kind of want to zone in and think
Yeah.
about this thing and can we get to this thing, when really influence is much of a opening up
Mhm.
experience.
You are bang on. And I think, when people say I need to learn how to influence better, I don't think for the most part they're thinking about that, of
Hmm.
sort of opening up the conversation. They are thinking about how do I get heard more or how do I get my idea pushed forward or whatever it might be. Um,
Hmm.
I really think that shift needs to happen when you talk about if I want to be a good influencer, it's about the conversations that we're having,
Hmm.
not about winning.
Right. Because influence isn't necessarily win.
not at all.
And that's, I mean, it's we talked about it being negotiation adjacent, but it's not negotiation. You're not in a win-win-win thing, but
Hmm.
you're in a mutuality creation. And
Yeah.
that takes space to understand whether that's truly there or not.
Hmm.
And when you try, and if you don't open it, you're putting a result between you, right? That's so when I teach communication, it's always relationship first, result second. And it plays into being able to influence, because if it's always about the result, that's where you're gonna veer into techniques that feel manipulative. You're gonna veer into
Yeah.
persuasion. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I know you're bang on that one. Yeah.
Awesome. I love being bang on.
Yeah. And it could make your day.
Awesome. So it's kind of, I don't know if we've been clear about the difference between the skills and the strategies, because they play into each other, right? Why
Hmm.
you use a certain skill and why it's strategic, because the the strategy really is to create space in your own head to think through what is the best approach, how do they prioritize, when is the best opportunity, right time to have this conversation, because you're basically setting yourself up for a conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, and that sort of plays into, we didn't really talk about how do you influence laterally in your peer group when you really don't have any influence over them, I guess, if
there's
you
no
will.
there's no power dynamic
There's no
there.
power dynamic, right? And so, and that is about the conversation. That is about being collaborative. That is about opening up conversation, saying, could you help me help you, or you help me help, that sort of thing. So I think that is an important aspect of connecting. And your peer group is super important to you, to see you as a strong leader in the
Agreed.
organization, as you sort of all go up together, the ranks together. And you want them on your side. You want them to be your allies. And you get there by being collaborative with them. And then through that, there's some influence that may happen. But
Right.
I think it's an
And I
important aspect to think about. It's not about always up.
right and peer networking is very powerful, right? And your network, your ability to build network, has a lot to do with that referent power of are you influencing others, right?
Yeah.
How many other people find you influencing is gonna
Mhm.
is gonna impact whoever you're gonna influence next. And that, because there's no power dynamic, there's a lever around higher purpose, right?
Mhm.
What are we working together to actually do, right? And really understanding, being able to push on those things from a value center and an emotional drive, right? How do people really feel about what that is for them?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, it's an important skill. It's an important way of being within an organization. We need to be thinking about it. Certainly be more cognizant of it as we're sort of engaging in it, and sort of the why behind it.
Yeah. Well, you're
Um,
kind of doing it all the time
you are.
at some level by just how you show up.
Yeah.
But if you don't feel you have the influence because you're not recognized, or you don't feel you're given the floor, people just don't see you at the level you feel you want to be seen. These are key things to start. And I think some people, especially if they're in large organizations, don't appreciate the network building at the level. They kind of feel like they know people in their AOR. They understand, how it works in my neighborhood,
Sure.
but they don't really understand how valuable it is to know people in a lot of places, right? So um it starts with, who are you meeting? How are you setting yourself up to just have access to people in other places in an organization? Because those connections are valuable as much as connections in your direct chain or your direct stakeholder sphere, right?
Hmm.
Because sometimes you don't know when you got to know somebody in a part of the organization that's going to benefit you or could benefit you.
Yeah.
And so it feels like I gotta go meet people. And it's like, how do you participate in a way that you can meet people,
Hmm.
to begin to get network enough to understand, because that builds your referent credibility
Yep.
of this
Absolutely.
person knows people. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, if you're showing up in a zone of influence as a knowledge expert, sometimes you need to tap into those other expertise in the team in order to shore up your how you're showing up, right? And so having those connections that gives you almost poetic license to tap into their knowledge as well. And so you want that. You don't want to, you can't work in silos. You need to be collaborative, and the reciprocity comes into play there as well, right? You
Yeah.
get what you give.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a level of time. I mean, yeah, you can walk in off the street and have a background that you bring that might give you a credibility boost, which would see you as more influential than somebody who doesn't have the kind of background. But that's one piece of a broader sense of what you need to bring to the table. And so I think you have to understand that there is time associated with this because people need to know who you are as well.
Yeah.
And coming in cold, you come in empty, right? You come in with what they've heard,
Mhm.
not what they know.
No, and you can't influence from that perspective because, again, you don't have that credibility, you don't have that trust level, and dare I say it, sometimes you come in as a bull in a china shop because you think you know everything, and I see that all the time, right? Newer leaders, like functional ability, they could do the job, but they don't have those softer skills, and so influencing is a softer skill, and really thinking about it as a skill to sharpen will serve everybody really well.
And I just want to emphasize that it takes time.
Yeah.
And if you're willing to put in the time, you're gonna build. You're gonna build it. You're gonna, especially if
Yes.
you do it with intention.
Kind of like kung fu.
100%. It Kung Fu. Influence as Kung Fu. It is.
It is. Time, patience,
Discipline.
transformational change. Awesome. All right.
Exactly. All right. Well, hopefully that was helpful information for all y'all who are trying to be more strategic in how you influence, having a little bit better understanding of what it really means to influence, how you accidentally get out of it, and what some good strategies are. Tell your friends if they need to know about the podcast. Give us your comments, and we appreciate all of you who continually listen to us, regardless of our internet drama and all of the sounds of paper and things that happen in the podcast.
And my
We
echoey
appreciate you.
podcast.
Yes, we
Awesome.
appreciate you. All right,
We
we'll see you on
do.
the next episode.
All right. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Sandy.
Thank you so much for listening. You can check out Sandy's website at satoriconsultinginc.ca. That's SATORI consultinginc.ca, and visit Jen's website at own-up.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.